basically the question is, what is the difference between the dark night of the soul and just like normal depression? Because I've seen like cases where a person has been depressed for some time, and then he goes online and discovers the theme or term, the dark night of the soul, and then immediately he will be like, oh well, that sounds like accurate, so I must be going through that, even though there hasn't been any spiritual practice involved. So is the dark night of the soul always like result from spiritual practice, or can it come into this life from previous lives practice, even though in this life there wouldn't have been any practice? So what is like the difference between regular depression
Okay,
and
great. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, to start with, can it just kind of carry over? It certainly can. And in fact, there are definitely instances of people, Eckhart Tolle is probably a good example that most people would know of, who really wasn't engaged in a spiritual practice, but entered into a kind of deep depression, which is probably partially sort of ordinary depression and partially a kind of dark night of the soul, because it precipitated a spiritual awakening. But there's, and there are other instances of that. More often, of course, it's going to be a result of practice. I think another instance that I gave of that, though, that I don't think was a function of spiritual practice, is a philosophy professor I had when I was in college. She talked one day about a spiritual awakening, and it resulted from a very dark moment, going into a very difficult place. And then right out of that came a powerful God consciousness experience. So these are complicated. The difference for me, see, it's not as though you can completely separate out the psychological and the spiritual, and sometimes they mix together. A person might have depression and a dark night of the soul at the same time, or they might have just one or just the other. So the difference is that a dark night really is an expression generally of the emergence of spiritual values and a spiritual sense of identity that leads to a crisis where you're kind of suspended in between two realities. And the one reality is your ordinary state of consciousness, your ordinary values, your ordinary desires. So for instance, let's say if a person is very ambitious in life, and they get their sense of their meaning from being powerfully involved in their worldly interests and in their work, and they work hard at it, and then they become attracted to spirituality. So they're doing that, and it's almost like it's an emergent part of them, and it's kind of in the background. They do it on the side, and it's not that well integrated with the rest of their life, and that's normal, and that's fine for a lot of people. But as it grows, as its influence grows, the part of them that's more spiritual and has spiritual values and wants to find value in life through a spiritual awakening and see life through a sense of greater wholeness and feel a deeper sense of being at peace and content with things as they are, rather than being caught up in the rat race of always trying to accomplish something or feel important or something like that. But what can happen is these two parts are now developing. One's been around, the worldly part, the other part's developing. And when it gets to the point when the spiritual part's strong enough, a crisis will arise where the person is, in a sense, needing to kind of die and be reborn, to shifting his identity from the worldly part to the spiritual part, because it's getting strong enough. And there'll be a period where they might be kind of suspended in between, in a kind of limbo, a dark night, almost like a purgatory, to use the Catholic term, or they're not quite fully able to embrace the other. And in fact, it might be kind of depressing because they used to get all their happiness from that, such, to the extent that they could. Now they still kind of want to do it, and at the same time it's just losing its energy. It's like they're starting to see too clearly how the ways in which it's not that great, and it's depressing that it's not that great. But the depression isn't because they were failed. Sometimes they were doing well at it. Tolstoy famously was like this. He had a nice family, a good wife, good relationship with his wife. He was successful as an author. And then he went through a dark night where he just started feeling like, well, is that all? Is this, this isn't fully fulfilling to me. And he went through a spiritual awakening. So there's a sense of, to use the Buddhist term, like I kind of turned it into an English word, dukkification. That's sort of my little term, my travestied version of the word. So the root word is dukkha, which in Buddhism means to suffer, to see the inherent unsatisfactory nature and pain. If you seek life in a dualistic way, it's going to be disappointing ultimately, even if you have temporary successes. So part of the spiritual path is becoming disillusioned with those values, with being a separate self and being worldly, being attached, having desires, and just trying to kind of play life in a way where you kind of get what you want and get as happy as you can be. Dukkha is the Buddhist term for the insight that grows about becoming disillusioned with all of that, saying, this isn't working. Even when it's successful, it's just temporary. It's not as fulfilling as I thought it would be. There's something still missing. So Tolstoy experienced that. And that's often part of a dark night, is that there is a kind of depression, you might say, but it's a spiritual depression. It's like, whereas very often ordinary depression is more like you do fully want to try to make life work, but it's not working. Or you have some kind of, but I think a lot of times people don't understand about depression too, is it can be partially or substantially some heavy emotions like grief or sorrow or sadness or loneliness that are either from this life or carried over from other lives. And they form a kind of foundational background feeling in your psyche, and they haven't been healed. So even when you do fulfill things, like you get into a relationship and you find somebody you really like, you'll still depressed because it can't overcome all these old feelings that you have. So depression is complicated too. This is actually potentially a big question because it gets into what's the nature of depression, and then what's the nature of a dark night, and how do we compare them? So it's a pretty big subject. But I hope that gives some sense that the dark night tends to be more about a kind of sorrow, a grief, a disillusionment, and you could call it a type of depression, but the underlying cause of that is more about that spiritual values and insight and wisdom is actually growing, and it's causing you to become disappointed, disillusioned, and just kind of outgrowing it. But you're not far enough into the new way that you can just be in that. You're stuck in between. So you're sort of in this, can't quite be in heaven, but I'm not fully outgrown all this other stuff so I'm sort of stuck in the middle. And in fact, St. Paul, who coined the term, or St. John of the Cross, he actually described two versions of the dark night. Stage one, which he called the dark night of the senses. And that's when the stage where it's mainly physical desires that you're dying to and being reborn in a more spiritual orientation. And then the dark night of the soul proper, which was a deeper, more psychological transformation where you're letting go of deeper emotional and mental identifications and awakening to spirit. I would take that a step further and say there's probably, each what we call initiation has its own dark night. So it's layers of so there's a general one about just getting on the path, but there's also stages of with strong focuses in different areas, like an emotional dark night or a physical dark night or a mental dark night. And they have a big component of awakening spirituality that you're being born into, and how that's influencing how you relate to how you used to be, becoming disillusioned with that. And that's different than depression. Depression can just be like wishing I could make this style of being work. It's just not. That's one type of depression. Or being haunted by old feelings that haven't been healed from the past.